The pandemic has disrupted the entire industry, and all brands across several categories are anxiously waiting to raise and revive the brands. Out-of-box thinking and innovative marketing strategy is the need of the hour to re-energize brands and get them back on the track. To stimulate demand is the one-point agenda of every brand. Many marketing pundits and experts who have been talking about rural has been always mentioning that rural is going to be the next destination for brands to revive the economy. To discuss this, we have a very interesting panel today who will talk and share their views on about how rural is going to be important in the coming years. Mr. Kunal Sinha, Chief Knowledge Officer Ogilvy, will be moderating the session today. May I now request Kunal to formally introduce the rest of the panel members and kick off the webinar today. Over to you, Kunal. Mute, you are mute. You are on mute.
Thank you, Ganpati. I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today. On the panel, as Ganpati said, we have three very, very knowledgeable rural experts, as I would say, who have a point of view on what kind of changes are really necessary to unlock the rural demand, a demand that has always been talked about. But putting it all in the context of post-COVID situation and even the recovery from COVID makes it all that much more interesting from a consumer point of view. So, you know, some of the recent data that we've been seeing suggests that rural demand would recover faster than urban demand. What I would like everyone on the panel to take turns and talk about is which are the sectors where you see rural demand actually picking up. Can we start with Dr. Sachinandan Shukla, who is the Chief Economist at the Mahindra Group?
Sachinandan, you're mute.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this has to be the line for 2020, right? You're on mute. So for every complex question like this, right, there is typically an answer that is. Can you hear me? Sorry, I heard some disturbance.
No.
So for every complex question like this, is this better? I mean, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
So for every complex problem or a question like this, right, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So what I'll do is probably give you a slightly more complex answer. I think if I were to break it down in terms of very simple thing or a simple framework to understand, when you're looking at a problem which is macro and so macro that I'll just walk you through it in time, just take you back to February. The IMF actually forecast that about 160 countries will have per capita growth, which will be positive. Within 2 months, they came back and said it is going to be 183 plus countries which will have negative per capita growth this year. And if a problem which is as complex as, say, pervasive as this, we don't really know what has hit us. And therefore, the entire issue needs to be looked at from that perspective. I mean, a problem that is truly global. I mean, we keep referring to the global financial crisis as the last template that we looked at. But that wasn't really so global, right? I mean, the problem that you're seeing now is really, truly global. And with that perspective, I think what we're seeing is a lot of, say, government emphasis, government focus on the rural side. And what I want to highlight is, when you look at the rural sector, the kind of money that the government is really spending now has not been seen for the last 10 years post the GFC, right? So the government spending part is the highest that has been there in the last 10 years. If you look at the near term now, right, just after when the lockdown started, if you look at how much money the government has spent in procuring food grains, it has been about 80 odd thousand crore, just the wheat part. If I include rice and some of these other things, the number comes to about 1 lakh 15 odd crore. I mean, these are ballpark numbers. If we add the PM Kisan bit and also the Manrega part, the government has spent nearly 1.5 lakh crores in just about 2 months, right? So with that kind of a perspective, I think anything which is small ticket size, right? Because the kind of issues that we see on incomes, I mean, I started my point by saying that per capita incomes are going to be negative for 180 plus countries. If you have a income shock, if your outlook is really clouded by the lack of clarity on vaccine, on lockdowns, etc., I think the spending bit will be cautious. So when we try and answer or try to look at something which is looking at sectors which will benefit, anything which is a small ticket, near term is going to be preferred by most people. So I think I'll probably stop at that. We can probably expand it when we move ahead in this talk.
Adrian, I will put it to you. As are you seeing any kind of recovery now that there is certain amount of opening up from a say and for everyone here, Adrian is the head of customer centricity at Tata Sons, so he has a perspective across different companies in the Tata Group.
Yeah, so Kunal, I completely agree with Sachidanand. I think one of the after effects of the government taking steer of this is not just the income that flows into the rural consumer, but also the confidence that it kind of begets, right? And for that reason, whether you talk to people within our group or you talk to people outside, the main pickup is likely to be seen and has already been seeing in, as Sachidanand said, lower ticket consumer products, but equally lower ticket brown goods. If you talk of coolers and you talk of fans and things like that, as well as OTC products that are available. Of course, when you couple that with an equally good sowing season where, twice the acreage has been put under sowing vis-a-vis last year, that sort of presages a good offtake even for agri inputs when I talk to my colleagues in that sector. And they've also been seeing, interestingly, and at slight variance to what Sachidanand said, early interest in higher ticket items like tractors and so on and so forth. Of course, how that will play out is yet to be seen. Equally, one of the interesting facts I picked up was, given that this reverse migration means that there are a lot of people moving back, you do need the building of temporary dwellings, refurbishment, so on and so forth. So even things like sheds, etc., are seeing an uptick in terms of what you would call, or what we would call, construction technically in the rural sphere. So all around, I think these symbols of and signifiers of recovery are there. But I still think it's too early to call, having spoken to several people and looking at the numbers we're looking at. It seems positive right by now, but by no means is its sustainability a foregone conclusion.
So, Prosenjit, what is your sense of what you see as some of the bottlenecks in realizing some of that demand?
I completely agree with both Sachidanand and Adrian. In my opinion, there are three things which have to happen, or it depends. The rural demand bouncing back depends largely on three things happening. The first is, of course, that how effective is the transmission of all the money that the government is spending on rural. So these are big numbers. 1,50,000 crore plus, out of which 100 lakh crores is just about the Manrega. But unless the money reaches the account, that we have seen lags in the past, so unless it is effectively transmitted, the incomes will not rise no matter what the macro picture says. Absolutely. The second thing is that, of course, we are assuming that the metro department's monsoon projections are correct, that we will have a good monsoon and that agriculture will have a fairly decent growth this year. The third thing that I think that we are hoping for is that there is no major transmission or virus infection breaks in rural areas. Because if that happens, that means that the money which would have gone to FMCG or brown goods goes straight into healthcare. Right? So these three things, unless these three things happen together, in the sense that the transmission and infection in rural areas is much lower and it doesn't really speed up, and the incomes actually grow, I do not see a huge leap. And again, here I would like to qualify a bit. One is that if you are saying a huge leap over the first month of lockdown, yes, because incomes will be growing normal. But if you're talking about a huge leap over this time last year, I'm not so sure that whether that is something that we will see in the next 6 months.
True. So, I just want to, just yesterday, the Prime Minister announced free food grains until November, and then West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee said until next year. Now, do you see some of this freeing up some money in the consumer's hands for spending on other items, which of course companies would like them to spend on?
For me, who is that question in?
Whoever wants to take a Sachidanand.
Go first.
Right. So if you look at what the government has really been trying to do, and I just want to say this upfront. I think if you looked at the commentary in the West when this pandemic began, some of these guys were not really willing to believe that the death rate is so low, and they've been writing column after column in some of these newspapers that a lot of people read. Basically, they were really shattered at how low the death rate is. And I think nobody really dying of hunger over the last 3 months. So yes, we've seen very sad images of people walking hundreds of kilometers, etc. But looking at our history, looking at our per capita income, looking at our population profile, I think this is something that we can be really happy and proud about, that not a single person has died because of hunger during this pandemic. It's a big achievement for the Indian economic system and the management. Yes, I understand the distress part, but I think this is something that we need to be proud about. Secondly, I think we need to look at the agri picture holistically. So when I spoke earlier, I spoke about only the spending that has happened post the lockdown began. So I spoke about only 1.5 trillion. Let me now make another point. I think when you look at the next, say, 12 months, if you look at the GDP, agriculture is the only sector where you will see YOI growth, right? If you look at industry, if you look at services, none of these will be able to produce the same output as in, say, FY20, even till 2022. So basically, industry and services will be set back by at least 2 years, whereas agriculture is the only segment in the economy, when you look at it from a segment perspective, sector perspective, that will see a YOI growth. And therefore, the other point is that if you look at what has been happening in the agri story, you spoke about some money being there with incremental money being there with the people. I think what is happening is we also need to look at the inflation bit. So September 19 onwards, the deflationary patch that you saw in agriculture went away. If you look at the GVA, I mean nominal GVA in agriculture, from there we can see that the inflation has been around 8%, which means there has been pricing power with the farmers, and couple that with the government initiatives when it comes to spending that I spoke about. If you look at the willingness and ability of a farmer or a person on the rural side, see, we need to remember that the rural story is not only the agrarian story, because nearly 55% of the incomes come from non-agriculture. There you have the NREGA play, the spending that the government does on various schemes, etc. But from an ability perspective, you had a bumper harvest, and the government has been procuring a lot of food grains, and therefore there is some money with you. When you look at the willingness, what you look at is the forecast for the monsoon. You look at what has been the rainfall in June, which has been 20-22% higher than the previous year. And then if you recall, June 19 was minus 33% last year in terms of rainfall. And you also have MSPs that have been announced in a timely fashion. Plus, through the year, the government is going to be spending about, the government has spoken about Farmgate Infra Fund of about 1 trillion. There is concessional credit of 2 trillion and emergency working capital fund of about 300 billion. So I think if you look at the picture in totality, what I'm saying is not only is the ability of the farmers or the people on the rural side way higher than other people in the other segments of the economy, but also there is a huge tailwind from government spending and their willingness to really spend, because you have some certainty of incomes growing, which no segment in the economy today has. So I think if you look at the complete picture, the rural side looks like, I would not say that is the only game in town, but definitely a big game in town. And I don't really think that you have so much certainty in any other segment.
So I will add to what Sachidanand said. I think that in the rural sector, definitely it will see growth. But here again, I will expand on the point that he had already made. At the moment, sitting where we are in July, we should look at the agricultural farm incomes, that definitely increasing. Again, coming back to the first point that I made initially, the non-agricultural part of the rural economy, which includes a lot of the construction and all, Manrega and stuff, will depend also on how good the action is on the ground. Because we have seen that there have been differences from state to state. There have been huge differences from the way that things get transmitted and how money gets transferred also. But I would tend to agree that if the food is efficiently transferred for the next 3 months, as the government has said, then there should be some amount of disposable income, at least not only in the farmer hands, but also in the non-agrarian part of the rural economy, provided jobs bounce back because of Manrega and infrastructure projects started by the government and stuff. So that would be my view.
Thanks.
Kunal,
Yeah,
I think Sachidanand laid it out so well, right? And Prasenjit, in his typically authoritative style, I think also told us how that could play out. One of the interesting things that I've observed, and I approach it from the point of view, Prasenjit and Sachidanand, of what brands will do in response to these likely scenarios, with all the caveats put in there. And one of the things that has happened is with reverse migration, at least where it's happened and in the more wealthier rural states, is that the people who have gone back, they've taken a little bit of their money, but they've also taken their habits and preferences, right? So when they get redeployed or are getting redeployed in states where farm labor was earlier short and now is not short anymore, they've also been insisting on an increase in daily rates. And some of these places, they record daily rates of 50 to 100% more than last year. And if they were getting one meal previously by contractors, they are now getting 3 meals. The food is better, there are living quarters. So all put together, it tells me that at least your net disposable income is going to increase. Now, whether that is a result of them, making sure or being opportunistic, given that it's a good farming season, or the fact that, government subsidies, etc., are percolating through, the fact is there will be a certain change and a certain social effect of all of these people coming back and buying brands rather than unbranded, insisting on a certain way of life. I mean, that transmits socially far more powerfully than any government scheme, which takes a lot of time to percolate down to the last household.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, what do you reckon is the, people have returned and some people are going to again come back. So how much of reverse migration that has taken place? One is, do you have any estimates that you can share with the larger audience of what the size of that might be? And then how much of it is going to be temporary? How much of that is going to be, in your estimate, a long-term return? And
So, it's extremely difficult to figure out any exact numbers. I think Sachidanand actually might have better numbers about the state of migration.
So if you look at the reverse migration bit, right, what we need to focus now also is some numbers on people really with the unlock happening, right? Unlock 1 and 2, etc. I think we need to look at how many people are trying to come back to the cities. The last number that I saw, and this is the Indian Railway number, about 25 lakh people per day. Now, to put this in perspective, this sounds like a huge number, but when things were normal in the pre-corona era, right? I think the numbers are about 2.3 or 2.5 crore people traveling by trains per day, right? But I think to put it in perspective, a lot of state governments, a lot of industries, sectors, etc., have been cognizant of the impact of migration. Typically, we've seen in the past pandemics across the world in terms of empirical data that people do move away from these hubs of the pandemics. These have been typically cities, even during the Spanish flu shock. And I think that is something that we have as hardcore numbers. Typically, people have to pay a lot higher to get these people back. But because we are seeing the unlock happening in a graded fashion, I mean, different state governments really taking a differential call, I think these numbers may vary. But I think to me, I would prefer to look at how many people have started to move back to cities, which is now, I think, the railway number that I cited, 25 lakh people traveling back to cities per day. I think that to me is a positive augury. And also, I think if you look at the responses from, say, some of these more industrialized states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, etc., governments have also been cognizant of this problem. They're trying to get these people back. And I think the best way to get them back is go back to normalcy, resume some of these activities. I think that will attract a lot of people. So I don't really subscribe to the belief that a lot of people are going to stay back where they are. They've gone back to their villages, they'll remain there. I don't really believe that will happen. I think with the unlock 1, 2, etc. happening, we will see more and more people coming back to cities because the world has really changed, right? I mean, we talk about the aspirational Indian, we talk about livelihoods, we talk about the standard of living, etc. So I think the rural or the agrarian system still doesn't have what it takes for crores of people to continue to stay back into their rural roots. I don't really believe that will happen. And therefore, let's probably monitor some of these numbers going forward as each state really unlocks or relaxes some of these economic activities.
So, Sachidanand, okay. So, Sachidanand, I will just say that I don't have the numbers. I have only the anecdotes that I've heard from Punjab and Haryana, where farmers, the bigger farmers, are still facing a huge shortage of labor. They are willing to pay double the salaries if they get the labor during the sowing season. The problem they are talking about is not even willingness of workers to come back, but logistical problems in the sense that your railways are only running about 400 special trains, right? That is nowhere near enough that even if a person is willing to come back, he has to wait probably for the next 20 days before he gets his turn. And see, unlike migration, where people started walking on foot for thousands of kilometers, reverse migration will happen when the means of transport, the buses, the long distance buses and the trains are moving smoothly, which I understand has not yet happened. So that is that.
So, Prasenjit, I think you're completely right. I mean, one of the interesting numbers I looked at was, remittances within the country. I knew that for the bigger numbers, we'd have Sachidanand on the conversation, so I didn't bother to look those up because who better than him? But when you look at remittances, of course, first remittances were shut down during the absolute lockdown. But as they opened up, about 1/5 of them were traveling in the other direction, which is people in rural areas were sending money to people who had gotten stuck in urban areas.
Yeah.
And having spoken to some of these consumers who've even gone back and managed to reach their village, etc., one part of it is, are they able to reach those sites of work? The other part is, when they're close to that work, do they want to do that work, and do they see themselves doing that work? Many of them are quite restless, because they'll confess to you that it's easier to come back and drive a cab in a city than it is to do backbreaking farm labor. And also seeing the fact that when you come back to the city, it's a hard scrabble life, but at least there is the guarantee of sustained employment, whatever route that takes. Whereas in rural, things are, one good season, another bad season, and you're back to square one. So
Precisely.
I wouldn't put the bets on, reverse migration becoming some sort of secular trend, just as Sachidanand was saying.
So, putting this in context, I mean, obviously, if agricultural growth is going to sustain as opposed to services and manufacturing, then the consumption power in rural areas is likely to remain strong and go up, and that optimism will remain. What do you think brands need to offer to rural consumers in order to boost demand? Now, certainly in urban areas, we are seeing health and hygiene and convenience being two big drivers of consumption, because people's habits are changing thanks to COVID, and some of it are likely to persist.
So, Kunal, do you do this for people who have gone back or people in the cities?
No, I'm talking about rural consumers.
Okay, so the people who have gone back and the rural consumers. Okay.
Yeah, it's people who are already there, or those who have gone back.
Yeah.
What brands we offering them in this context where growth is likely to continue, and therefore there will be some certainty about incomes?
Well, I can take a stab at that, Prosenjit, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because when we started, just before we started, we were talking of all the books that we have on our shelves that we never read. I picked out one book that is quoted more often than it is actually read, which was C.K. Prahlad's Bottom of the Pyramid. And, two of the things that he says in terms of the principles of bottom of the pyramid innovation still hold true, which is price performance for the rural consumer, but also access and distribution. And by that, I don't just mean access from a roads, etc. point of view, where you reduce the burden or the friction that it takes for a rural consumer to obtain that product, whether you route it through retail stores or you route it through farmer producer organizations. And what we find is that the rural consumer, at least the studies that I've done before, they value information and education and knowledge much more than they value glamour or the glamour of advertising. I mean, advertising is entertaining, but they are looking to make sure that they extract the maximum value. The price performance parameter that Prahlad talked about is far more stringent for the rural consumer, including the fact that perhaps brands need to always figure out and innovate how to reduce the risk involved in buying or trialing products, which is far higher for rural consumers. And I'm not just talking now of FMCG products, I'm also talking of slightly higher value products like roofs and other materials that go into construction, etc. Maybe steel wires that go to protecting your farm lot and so on and so forth. For them, the risk of something going wrong is much higher because they only have so much income. So that risk mitigation, if brands can provide at a lower price point, is very, very essential, which is why you see in rural brands, at least well-known, reputed brands, are valued much more than they are in more wealthy markets or more urbanized markets or more developed markets. So this combination or this rubric of trust, of price performance, as well as reduction in terms of the friction of obtaining a product or service, layered with knowledge and confidence, are the parameters that I find constantly recurring, no matter which era of rural consumption you talk of, Kunal. That would be my point of view.
So I would agree with you, Adrian. I would definitely say that a little bit extra value in a trusted brand for the same amount of money would be very, very important. Whether it's FMCG or whether it's cement, whatever you're talking about, if the brand is trusted and if they offer a little bit extra, given the fact that everybody is looking at spending less,
yes,
it helps a lot. But there is one thing that I would like to talk about, which almost nobody is talking about now, which is the supply side problems. Because of the way that different states followed the lockdown as to, and I'm sure that Mahindra and Adrian and Tata would have faced the same problem, that there were factories which were working in some states and there were factories which were not working. There were borders which could not be crossed. And that has quite often created a thing where there is a demand, but there is no supply. And I think that over the next 6 months, the brand which manages to figure out the most reliable supplies will always win over the guy, no matter what his brand perception is, if he's just simply not available. And this has cropped up a lot after the first lockdown started and has not got sorted out as yet.
True, that's an important point. Satchidanand, you have a point on?
Not really on the brands, but I think Adrian and Mr. Datta are really subject experts there. But I just wanted to make a qualification. When I started out, when I said that there are income uncertainties and people probably will prefer to the smaller ticket size items. Time, since you had mentioned tractors initially, and I didn't really want to speak about it. What you see is an extreme divergence in terms of what gets consumed. What I mean by this is the income uncertainty, etc., will keep you looking at the smaller ticket items. But at the same time, wherever there is a big macro push, right, like the government spending part that I spoke about and things like that, you'll also find that within the rural spectrum, things like tractors and some of these things which are supposedly high ticket will also do very well because of the macro trend or the government push and the initiatives that we spoke about. So what I'm saying is you will see a dichotomy and that might look a bit confusing at times. But what I'm saying is that consumer trends will follow both the macro trend, which is the broader push that I spoke about, and also the micro trends where the willingness and ability to consume really manifests in what you really buy. So I think we need to be looking at both the spectrums when we look at the performance of brands or certain items, durable items.
And I would say that of the products, I would also say that I would bet on mobile phones, handsets being a big winner. Because there is so much, including education in rural areas, which is happening on mobile phones now. I would tend to think that this is as big a boost to mobile phones as anything that has happened so far.
Yeah, Prasenjit, you preempted my sort of next question.
Okay.
Which was to do with the potential of technology. And obviously, we've seen there's been a big uptick in just the usage of mobile phones and the ways we are using technology, from digital payments, contactless payments in the urban areas. What do you see? So certainly education is one area that you've developed, but largely mobile phones have been used for communications and entertainment. And TikTok, which got banned yesterday, provide a big fillip to entertainment in small towns and rural areas. So where do you see really the potential of technology and what the impact of that on marketing and consumption might be? Adrian, would you like to start on that?
I think the fact that mobile phones, as Prasenjit was saying, will take an uptake either for education or entertainment is very true. I mean, all of us, whether in rural or urban, want things to amuse us. What I've seen more interestingly during this time is the rapid pivot that various brands and companies have started doing. So if you take commercial vehicles, for instance, when the lockdown was announced, suddenly people were stranded, whether you're a mechanic or a driver's assistant or a driver. And if you need to do any repair or maintenance, you are completely at sea. That's when I think the improved connectivity and people having mobile phones, albeit lower end mobile phones, really helped, and brands have used that to help people to keep operations continuing, to train them, to build skills at this time. And most brands have been very, very egalitarian or unselfish at this point in time, where they've tried to help. I mean, I can take the example of Tata Motors commercial vehicles, for instance, where it didn't matter which truck you drove. If you needed help, you could tap into their helpline and learn. And that's where I see the utility of technology, or even in the agri-input domain, where if you need people to aggregate demand, you use apps that people use to place an order, but then you use the farmer producer organizations and retailers as the point of sale or procurement, so that the people who need those goods and agri inputs can come and pick it up. So the fact that technology is allowing previous processes to continue, I think for me is a bigger fillip and perhaps a more sustainable and permanent one. I mean, entertainment and education, etc., being what it is, the fact that this seeps into the real economy that has real dollars and rupees attached to it is for me a much more encouraging and I think illuminating sign.
Yeah. Sachidanand, what are your thoughts on the role of technology going forward?
See, I think Adrian rightly mentioned the role of FPOs, some of these apps, aggregator apps that we also as a group have been really exploring, and we really have been surprised with the propensity of a typical average rural person or a farmer to be able to take this up and really utilize some of these services that are on offer. And I think one of the key things that we've noticed is for years, one of the biggest problems or the Achilles heel that we say for agriculture has been the lack of infrastructure, and which is why you can't or you haven't really been able to take the market at the doorstep of the farmer. And I think some of these issues are now getting circumvented by use of technology. Mobile phones is the example that Adrian gave. And I think a lot of people have started to explore that option, and we remain very, very positive with the sheer adaptability and propensity to use technology by some of these people on the rural side or on the farm side. We have been surprised, and a lot of people, I think, if you look at just the sheer numbers in terms of quantum as to how many people really use this, we will be surprised. So I think, yes, this has given an opportunity to circumvent the great Indian infra deficit, and the farmers or the rural people are going to be using this much more than before, and we are seeing traction in almost all of these segments, and which is much higher than what we would have thought in a typical time.
I would only add one more sector, which is healthcare to this.
Yeah.
I think that already, even in urban areas, I think healthcare started happening over a video consult, and I think that is also going to be the big thing going forward in rural healthcare.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
the delivery of healthcare.
And the auxiliary.
Delivery of healthcare,
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So engaging with the Anganwadi workers and the A&M,
Yes.
yeah, I mean that really that is the potential which perhaps needs to be realized. Yeah, sorry, Adrian, you were saying something.
No, I was saying Prasenjit's point is absolutely spot on. Healthcare, not just in terms of telemedicine, but also if we take this opportunity, as Sachidanand said, to capitalize on it, and some of that government subsidy, government support, etc., flows into skill development, you can have paramedical workers really be the intermediary or the hybrid between delivering advice and delivering actual healthcare, at least at a primary level. And given that we are in the midst of a pandemic, I mean, nothing could be better than setting up or using this to set up a healthcare delivery system that combines technology and the human touch.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions, and since we were here, so I just want to put it to you folks, and so that the person who's asking the question doesn't get too impatient. And this one is a very specific one, which is to do with what measures can fertilizer companies take, because here a small ticket size or smaller SKU can't work. So how could they possibly build greater engagement during this sort of time of crisis?
See, I'm no expert on fertilizers, but I will say only one thing. The biggest hurdle currently for spending on anything is credit. So a longer credit term or a favorable credit offering will always help a buyer pick up the stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would not only work for fertilizer, but across the farm
Yes,
sector.
in fact, one of the things that that there is a pent-up demand of motorcycles is what I have heard. But equally, a lot of the motorcycle demand is constrained by the fact that your NBFCs who were earlier offering loans at very good terms are not yet on their feet. So until they can start offering, so a lot of sales are stuck now because the financing is not available. The demand is there, but the financing is not available.
So Kunal, let me approach this a little differently just to make it a little interesting. Prasenjit is absolutely right. Credit is the lifeblood. And I think the sooner you can dole that out, the smoother you can dole that out, you'll see an uplift. But to the question, and I don't know if you've been watching, Kunal, the chat window, but Yatanshu Kothari has put up, I think, in response to my offer of books that are quoted more often than they are read, We Are Like That Only by Rama Bijapurkar. And Rama, when she launched this book, We Are Like That Only, I actually took the most interest in the rural chapters over there. And she gives the example of Hindustan Petroleum. And she says, people in rural India, they want to cook in smokeless stoves, right? But they can't afford a large LPG cylinder. At the same time, if HPCL reduces the size of the cylinder, then it's not viable for them the cost of operations to deliver it there. And the solution there was the innovative creation of a community kitchen, which was run by a local entrepreneur. And you did a pay per use kind of system, which allowed people to afford it and, mitigate their risk of buying something or manage their cash outflow. My question to the fertilizer question is to put it back and say, we're asking the question with the same modus operandi that we operate today. I think now is the time to rethink how we operate and go back to Dr. Prahlad's advice on how to innovate for rural in rural rather than cut paste the urban or bigger town model into rural. I mean, now's the time to revisit those orthodoxies and perhaps collectivize and collaborate for many of the producer and manufacturer organizations, if they are to reduce the cost to them, but also reduce the price and increase the value to the end user.
Yeah, which in a way is kind of, with your responses in a way interesting, in the context of another question which was being asked, which is, how do smaller brands pitch their value proposition to these rural consumers, whether they're migrants or non-migrant, which makes me put it in the context of smaller local brands. Yeah, Prasenjit, you talked about, obviously distribution challenges for larger companies, but companies, brands that are very local, for them, probably this sort of walling of territories presents them a unique opportunity because, the consumers are right there. They have better access than companies which would have traditionally been thought of having all the distribution power with them.
So they have a great goodwill. See, one is that they have, quite often they offer better terms, the smaller brands. And by smaller brands, I mean medium-sized brands which are state or at least half a state, dominate half a state. They quite often offer better terms, better credit terms to the distributors. And which is why they are favored, they are pushed. But more importantly, they are favored because their rate of replenishment is much faster than a bigger brand. A local chips can afford to send a guy there twice a day to refill in a small village also, which your Lay's your Pepsi might not do. So there, I think that they do have a goodwill. Plus, if they are, so in an extremely local area, they also have a goodwill because they are employers themselves, right? So they have a chance of doing it. But the great, handicap they also have is that they also get a smaller brand typically is the first to face financial problems because the banks don't give him the same credit terms that they give, let's say, a Pepsi. And that is, if they can manage their finances, this is a great opportunity to do it. But my fear is that the first thing that the banks and NBFCs will do is that, look, he's a medium-sized entrepreneur, and there was some figure I saw today that actually the credit to SMEs had fallen far more sharply than credit to bigger companies. I think I was seeing it in Hindu Business Line or one of those, probably New Indian Express I was seeing it. So a lot of it will depend on how the credit flows also to them.
In addition, I think, Prasenjit, one of the success of local brands, at least in the categories that you mentioned, is the fact that they cater very sharply to local tastes and preferences.
Yes, they do.
So, I mean, so they already have a good value proposition, both from a price as well as, performance.
Yeah, so I am talking about, I am talking about their being hampered by production capabilities because of financing.
Oh, of course, at this time.
I mean, yeah, if they can supply, they are better off. Pratap Snacks, or what is it called? I think Pratap Snacks in MP. It's an extremely strong brand. But if it can't produce at the full volume that it is doing, it gains nothing from the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
So even with these, I would just like to add, I mean, if I look at just the numbers, I think this has to follow logically in the sense fertilizer sales will always follow a decent crop outlook or output. When I just look at the numbers, I think, and this includes urea, DAP, etc. So even the complex fertilizers. Last year, half, fertilizer sales grew about 28%, right? And when I look at the numbers in April, May, and this follows some of the comments that I made earlier, fertilizer sales have risen by nearly 46% in April and May. So notwithstanding some of the challenges that we are talking about, I mean, we've spoken about, Mr. Datta pointed out finance, which is key, the supply chain management, inventory management, etc. I think this is following the broader trend of income levels really moving up on the farm side beginning September last year. And you see that manifest in numbers. I mean, the second half numbers were exceptionally good at 28%, and just April, May, despite the supply disruption, some of these challenges that we see on logistics, the number is 46 odd percent YY. So I think this is really a testament to the kind of momentum that we have on the rural side.
Yeah. Good. I just want to pause a bit and request any of the participants, everyone who's listening, to pose their questions. I can see one already. So this is Dr. Debraj Ghoshal of SPGen, and he's asking, is there a scope for quality education for rural areas using the online offering by reputed urban education institutions?
I would tend to think yes, provided it is priced properly.
One is priced properly, Prasenjit. The other is you have to account for variability in delivery as well. Not all of these places, though connected, are connected consistently and enjoy the kind of bandwidth that we are experiencing on this call, for instance. And that's integral to customer experience, because after a while, especially in education, I've noticed after the initial novelty of procuring something online fades, then even a rural consumer who is not a gullible village bumpkin is worried about the UI, UX, and the experience, the customer experience, and will drop off. So with that caveat, yes, as Prasenjit said, pricing willing, there is enough of a market there.
So I would tend to think that the OTT model would work better than your live lecture model.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Yeah. So I would tend to think that if you have a password with which you can access a lecture and send questions back and get it answered, would be far more, because you are absolutely bang right that that there are times when you will never be able to get it. I mean, forget rural areas, even in cities. But I would tend to think that if you had a way of logging in and seeing it when your connection was strong, you would probably gain. That there is an opportunity.
Yeah.
So seeing how receptive, Kunal, people are to videos on WhatsApp, I'm sure the appetite for it is not dimmed. There might be other models as well.
Yeah. and Adrian, we've discussed this, I think, before. I mean, some of the inputs that we've been getting from research in small towns is the number. There's been an explosion in AI and ML classes there.
Right.
Yeah. And really, what's happening is because the technology graduates from the third and fourth rung engineering colleges aren't finding employment, but everything around. Whether it's CAD or AI or ML, that is catching people's fancy, and everyone's saying that is the future. You have to get equipped. So that is somehow really exploding in small towns.
Absolutely, Kunal. In fact, one theory, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing over here, but AI ML sounds very advanced. The fact that there are already in different stages 200 different rural BPOs, of course, at this point run by NGOs, tells me that even if you could pipe things like customer service as tutorials so that people could get employed by the e-commerce folks who are trying to constantly reduce costs, you might have an opportunity there. In fact, you have a bigger opportunity there because not everyone in a BPO today needs to speak in English or have great diction. If the domestic e-commerce market continues to grow the way it's doing, you could as well have people servicing people in each region based on the vernacular that they're comfortable in interacting with. So I think those are the kind of opportunities there are. So it's not just the fancy AI, ML, or the graduate degrees. There might be vocational skills that you can pipe through that I've always been a votary of.
Thanks. So we have a question from Kavita, who's Adrian's colleague. She's asking a question. While economic outlook remains positive and supply chain could also break through, what about consumer sentiment? Given so many challenges, will the consumer postpone consumption? Sachidanand, would you have any point of view on that?
Yes. In fact, when we talk about the consumer in general, and I'm starting off with the urban consumer, and then we can, since we've spoken about the rural consumer for a bit, see, I will take a macro cut and try and explain that. If you look at what has been happening, and when I take the GDP as a proxy for everybody's average income in the country, right? The nominal GDPs come down significantly, and this year we're talking about negative growth. Essentially, nobody's income really growing. And if you look around, see, when these stories are there in the newspapers that somebody is losing a job, etc., it's still further away from you. But when you start seeing or hearing about a person in your neighborhood or somebody you know who's losing job, I think then the story is much bigger and is going to have a slightly longer term impact, which we're seeing now. I mean, we haven't really seen this bad a situation prior to this. So it's sector agnostic, it's place agnostic. I mean, it doesn't really matter where you are. And if you look at the income levels, I mean, the GDP as a proxy, it's been sliding down for a few years now. 8-9 quarters we've seen the GDP number slide down. And that basically tells you that everybody, be it a corporate or an individual, the income levels have actually gone down quarter after quarter or year on year. With that kind of a thing and with these kind of shocks that you see right now, I mean, the fear psychosis caused by the pandemic, the trade wars and the global nuisance that you see on Twitter, I think consumer sentiment has taken a knock, and it will take a while before it perks up. It will take a lot of doing. I mean, you've seen nearly $16 trillion being, thrown in the Western economies. I mean, just the US and some of these other economies. When you talk about India, the government has done a 20 trillion package. I mean, they've announced, and these announcements will continue. But I would probably think that for the urban consumer to get back his mojo, you will need some kind of wealth effect or the income effect to really be a reality. I mean, he should be able to see or feel that. Only then will the sentiment really perk up. I'm not talking about these month-on-month numbers where just because of one segment being unlocked, you suddenly see a V kind of a number, right? I mean, the media is full of some numbers like these. So you can keep tracking those numbers. They look like V. These won't really matter unless the income or the wealth effect really percolates down and the sentiment really, I mean, the broader picture really improves. So I would remain a bit pessimistic on the urban consumer sentiment really coming back. But fortunately, the rural space is slightly different. And as we've discussed, rural consumption might stay buoyant for the reasons we've discussed. And these could be at both spectrums, very low ticket items and also higher ticket items like tractors.
Sachidanand, I think one of the interesting exercises that we did when we studied the rural consumer about half a decade back was to also find that when you disaggregate the rural consumer, you do find rural consumers who are disproportionately more resilient even in bad times. And of course, consume a lot more during good times. And these aren't always the wealthiest, but they're certainly the most progressive and the most influential. And you can mark them out very easily from the fact, Kunal, that they are influencers in their remit, in their close remit, in their geographic remit. So to Kavita's question and to Sachidanand's point, I think the fact that there might be also this uptick in rural consumption contributed to by consumers who are anyway more resilient to tough times. And, to use another effect, the Matthew effect would dictate that the strong keep getting stronger, which is to say that if a good year occurs, all the stars aligning, as Prasenjit said earlier, in terms of the monsoon and so on and so forth, you could actually see some rural consumers grow in terms of their real wages much faster than the urban consumer, isn't it, Sajita?
Yeah, thanks. I think we have time for just one question, which comes from Suman Banerjee, who's asking, don't you think increasing credit terms will increase the uncertainty in the future cash flow of the companies?
Sorry?
Don't you think increasing credit terms will increase the uncertainty in the future cash flow of companies?
See, I would just take a broader stab at this, and maybe Adrian and Mr. Datta can talk about it. Essentially, it all depends on the kind of company that you're talking about, right? Like Adrian just mentioned, the Matthew effect or whatever. So if the same theory applies here. You look at the biggest sort of companies, right? They can probably weather the storm for say next 6 to 12 months. The balance sheets are in a better position. But if you talk about the average company, and I'm not even talking about MSMEs, if you go in a sector, leave out the sector leader, most of the companies have not really been doing really well, right? So I will just use a proxy of say BSE 500 companies, etc. If you look at either the top lines or bottom lines, last 8 years, it's been only one way, down. And therefore, the ability of most of these companies to weather the storm is questionable. Therefore, your willingness to take credit is also a function of how bad or how good the balance sheet is. We've seen the RBI actually dole out a lot of credit through the TLTRO, right, which is targeted. And even there, we have seen the same effect. The top companies really getting most of the funds, and only they can really probably benefit from the availability of funds. But for most people, when you have an arbiter of finance, right, of cash, which is the banking system, even within the banking system, the ability of banks to really disburse credit is really in the hands of very few banks, right? So public sector banks, the balance sheet situation, very few people really have that wherewithal. Private sector banks, there are just a handful, you can count them on your fingers. And the whole NBFC space is really broken out of shape. So incremental credit given by public sector banks is just about 24%. And 75% of the incremental credit comes from private sector banks and NBFCs. And there, you don't really, we know for a fact that private sector banks don't really want to grow their books in a scenario like this where the probability of a default is higher. So I think it has to be seen in conjunction both with the company willing to take credit and the willingness of the banker or the lender to disburse credit.
In any case, the credit risk is borne by the wholesalers usually when it comes to consumer products, is my understanding, Kunal. So companies take their money upfront, but your wholesaler bears that credit risk as he distributes further when it comes to reaching rural, especially from free feeder markets. So I don't think it'll necessarily, as Sachidanand is saying, strain the bigger companies.
I think that's what we have time for today. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. And I'm sure everyone who's listened in for the past hour has benefited and is going back with certain, deep insight into where the opportunities are and what the challenges might be. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks.
It was really a
Thanks.
pleasure to have all of you. A very interesting session. I hope people have drawn some insights from this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Prasanjit. Thanks,
Bye.
Sachidanand. Lovely
Bye.
talking to you.
Bye, Sachidanand.
Same here. Thanks.